December 8, 1941. Somewhere in the cold, dark waters of the North Pacific, the Japanese aircraft carrier Akagi steams toward home. On the deck below, celebrations are in full swing. Pilots are shouting, laughing, embracing each other. Champagne is flowing. They're recounting the attack, the dive, the explosions, the burning American battleships at Pearl Harbor. They believe they've just executed the greatest naval victory in history. But in a quiet corner of the ship's operations room, one man isn't celebrating. Commander Minoru Genda sits alone at a small desk. In front of him, a single piece of paper covered in calculations. His face is pale. His hand trembles slightly as he writes. The numbers on that paper tell a story. A story that contradicts everything the celebrating pilots believe. A story that terrifies him. Genda has just realized something that will haunt him for the rest of his life. Pearl Harbor, far from being the decisive blow that would win the war, has actually guaranteed Japan's defeat. The attack succeeded brilliantly. 8 American battleships destroyed or damaged. Over 2,400 Americans dead. The Pacific Fleet crippled. But strategically, Genda understands what his fellow officers cannot see. This was a catastrophic mistake, and he knows exactly why. The math is simple, brutal, and undeniable. Japan has awakened a giant, and that giant has the industrial capacity to crush Japan completely within 4 years. This is the story of December 8, 1941, the day one. Japanese officer looked at the numbers and realized Pearl Harbor had just lost the war. To understand what Genda saw in those calculations, you need to understand the impossible situation Japan faced in December 1941. Since 1937, Japan had been fighting in China. 4 years of grinding, brutal warfare that consumed vast resources with no end in sight. The Chinese refused to surrender despite losing major cities and suffering millions of casualties. Japanese forces were spread thin across occupation duties, fighting both the nationalist government and communist guerrillas. The war was draining Japan's economy dry. But Japan's biggest problem wasn't military. It was industrial. Japan is a resource-poor island nation. It had virtually no domestic oil production, no rubber, limited steel production capacity. Almost every strategic material had to be imported from somewhere else. And in 1941, the United States, Britain, and the Dutch East Indies controlled access to most of those resources. In July 1941, after Japan occupied French Indochina, the United States made a decision that would change everything. They imposed a total oil embargo on Japan. Britain and the Dutch East Indies immediately joined the embargo. Overnight, Japan's oil imports dropped to nearly zero. Japanese strategic planners ran the numbers. At current consumption rates, the nation's oil reserves would last approximately 18 months. After that, the Japanese Navy would be unable to operate. The army would be paralyzed. The entire war machine would grind to a halt. Japan faced a choice. Option 1, withdraw from China. Negotiate with the Americans. Restore oil imports. Accept humiliation and abandon 4 years of sacrifice. Option 2, seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies by force. Ensure continued access to petroleum. Maintain the war in China. The Japanese military chose force. But there was a massive problem with option 2. If Japan attacked the Dutch East Indies, Britain would certainly declare war. And if Britain went to war with Japan, the United States would almost certainly follow. The Americans had a powerful fleet, the Pacific Fleet, based at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. That fleet could threaten every Japanese operation throughout the Pacific. It could reinforce the Philippines, attack Japanese supply lines, and make the conquest of Southeast Asia extremely difficult, possibly impossible. Japanese planners decided on a solution. A bold, aggressive solution. Destroy the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor before it could interfere. Then rapidly seize the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, the Philippines, and other resource-rich territories. Establish a defensive perimeter across the Pacific. Force the Americans to fight costly battles for every island. Eventually, the theory went the Americans would lose heart. They would negotiate a settlement that recognized Japanese conquests. Peace with honor. Japan keeps its empire. This was the plan. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, had grave doubts about this plan from the very beginning. Yamamoto wasn't like most Japanese naval officers. He had spent years in the United States as a naval attaché. He had studied at Harvard. He understood American industrial capacity in a way that most of his colleagues simply did not. He had visited American factories, walked through automobile plants in Detroit, witnessed the staggering scale of American mass production with his own eyes. He knew what the United States was capable of producing once it fully mobilized for war. Yamamoto reportedly told Prime Minister Konoe something chilling. "If ordered to fight, I can run wild for 6 months to a year. After that, I have absolutely no confidence." This wasn't pessimism. It wasn't defeatism. It was mathematics. Yamamoto had studied the production figures. He understood that the United States could build ships faster than Japan could sink them. He knew that in a long war of attrition, Japan had no chance whatsoever, but Yamamoto was overruled. The decision for war was made at the highest political levels, driven by military hardliners and nationalist fervor. All Yamamoto could do now was plan the Pearl Harbor attack to maximize its impact, to give Japan the best possible chance in those first 6 months. He assigned the tactical planning to one of Japan's most brilliant aviation officers, Commander Minoru Genda. Minoru Genda was known among pilots as Madman Genda, not because he was reckless, but because his ideas were so bold, so aggressive, that they seemed insane. When given the task of planning the Pearl Harbor attack, Genda threw himself into it with obsessive intensity. He studied every detail: British naval air attacks at Taranto, American defensive capabilities at Pearl Harbor, the optimal mix of torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters. He calculated approach routes, timing, coordination between strike waves. Genda's plan was tactically brilliant. 6 aircraft carriers would form the strike force, escorted by battleships and cruisers. They would approach Hawaii from the north, using bad weather and radio silence to avoid detection. At dawn on December 7th, they would launch a massive first wave of 183 aircraft. Torpedo bombers would skim low across the water, releasing specially modified torpedoes designed to run in Pearl Harbor's shallow depths. Dive bombers would scream down on Battleship Row. Fighters would strafe aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip on airfields. A second wave of 167 aircraft would follow, hitting survivors from the first attack and pounding shore installations. Speed, surprise, overwhelming force. On paper, it was perfect. And on December 7, 1941, it worked even better than Genda had dared to hope. The Japanese strike force approached Hawaii completely undetected. American radar operators spotted incoming aircraft but assumed they were expected B-17 bombers arriving from the mainland. At 7:48 a.m., the first bombs fell. The surprise was total, absolute, devastating. Within minutes, the battleship USS Arizona exploded in a massive fireball, killing over 1,000 men instantly. The USS Oklahoma capsized, trapping hundreds of sailors inside. The USS California and USS West Virginia sank at their moorings. The USS Nevada tried desperately to escape, to open water, but was beached to prevent her from blocking the harbor entrance. The second wave arrived and pounded everything that had survived. The first assault. By the time the attack ended 2 hours later, the damage was catastrophic. 8 battleships sunk or heavily damaged. Over 300 aircraft destroyed on the ground. 3 Americans dead, 178 wounded. It was the most devastating surprise attack in American naval history. Japanese losses: remarkably light, 29 aircraft destroyed, 5 midget submarines lost, fewer than 100 men killed. The tactical success ratio was extraordinary, almost unprecedented. As the strike force turned northwest and began the long voyage home, pilots celebrated their incredible victory. But there was something Genda knew. Something that gnawed at him even in the moment of triumph. The American aircraft carriers weren't at Pearl Harbor. The USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, and USS Saratoga were all at sea, delivering aircraft to outlying bases or conducting training exercises. Pure luck had saved them. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the strike force commander, made a critical decision. He refused to authorize a third strike wave to search for the carriers or to destroy Pearl Harbor's fuel storage tanks and repair facilities. He believed the mission had succeeded. He didn't want to risk his carriers searching for American ships that could be anywhere in the vast Pacific. Nagumo ordered withdrawal. The carriers turned for home. While pilots celebrated on the voyage back to Japan, Genda sat alone with his thoughts and a piece of paper. He knew the American industrial statistics. He had studied them meticulously while planning the attack. Now he began calculating what those statistics actually meant for the war Japan had just started, and the numbers were horrifying. Let me show you what Genda saw. Automobile production, 1941, United States, approximately 5 million. Vehicles, Japan, fewer than 50,000, that's a ratio of 100 to 1. Steel production per year, United States, 75 million tons, Japan, 7 million tons, that's nearly 11 to 1. Oil production per year, United States, 1.4 billion barrels, Japan, essentially zero domestic production. Even after capturing the Dutch East Indies, Japan would have access to perhaps 50 million barrels annually. That's a ratio of 28 to 1. Military aircraft production, 1941, United States, over 19,000 aircraft, Japan, approximately 5,000, nearly 4 to 1. These weren't just numbers on a page. They represented capacity. The capacity to build ships, aircraft, tanks, guns, ammunition. The capacity to wage industrial warfare on a scale Japan simply could not match. Genda calculated that the United States could replace every ship sunk at Pearl Harbor within 18 months. And most of the battleships weren't even truly sunk. They were sitting in shallow water. American salvage crews would raise them, repair them, and return them to service. Several would fight again before the war ended. The aircraft destroyed at Pearl Harbor, the United States was already producing over 19,000 military aircraft per year. They could replace the Pearl Harbor losses in less than a month. But the real problem, the thing that truly terrified Genda, wasn't replacing what was lost. The real problem was what America would build that hadn't existed before the attack. In 1940, the United States Navy had 7 aircraft carriers. By the end of the war, Genda calculated it would have close to 100. In 1941, the U.S. Navy had about 350 warships of all types. By 1945, it would have over $6,000. Japan in 1941 had 10 aircraft carriers and roughly 350 warships total. Japanese shipyards were building new vessels, yes, but slowly. Japan lacked the steel, the workers, the industrial infrastructure to match American production rates. Genda's estimates were brutal. For every ship Japan built, America would build 5. For every aircraft Japan produced, America would produce 4. For every trained pilot Japan graduated, America would graduate 3. And here's the crucial part. American pilots would have more fuel for training, more ammunition for practice, more aircraft to learn on. They would be better trained than Japanese pilots, because America had the resources to train them properly. Genda calculated that by late 1943, approximately 2 years into the war, American numerical superiority would become overwhelming. Japan would be unable to replace its losses. Every aircraft carrier sunk would be irreplaceable. Every experienced pilot killed would be gone forever. America, by contrast, would be producing ships and training pilots faster than Japan could destroy them. The mathematics of attrition favored America absolutely. There was another factor in Genda's calculations that made victory impossible. Geography. Japan's new defensive perimeter would stretch across thousands of miles of ocean, from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies, from New Guinea to the Marshall Islands, from Wake Island to the Aleutians. Defending that perimeter required dividing Japanese naval forces, stationing them at various bases, sending them on long patrols across vast expanses of ocean. This dispersion meant Japan could never concentrate its full strength at any single point. America, operating from Hawaii and eventually from captured islands, could choose where to attack. They could mass superior forces at the point of attack, while Japanese reinforcements were scattered across the Pacific, unable to respond in time. The principle of concentration of force favored the attacker, not the defender. Genda understood that Japan's strategy, forcing America to fight costly battles for every island, would actually accelerate Japan's defeat. Every battle, even if Japan inflicted heavy casualties, would cost irreplaceable Japanese ships, aircraft, and pilots. America could afford the losses. Japan could not. It was a war of attrition, and in a war of attrition against the United States, Japan had no hope of winning. The only question was timing. How long would it take for American industrial superiority to manifest itself in overwhelming military superiority? Genda's estimate, 2 years. By late 1943, American forces would be strong enough to go on the offensive. They would begin capturing Japanese-held islands, establishing forward bases, moving relentlessly closer to Japan itself, and there would be nothing Japan could do to stop them. Genda quietly shared his concerns with some of his fellow officers on the voyage home. Most dismissed his pessimism immediately. They argued that Japanese fighting spirit, the legendary Bushido warrior code, would overcome American material advantages. They believed that American soldiers, soft and undisciplined after years of peace and prosperity, would lack the will to fight a long, bloody war. They convinced themselves that America, a democratic nation of immigrants with no unified national identity, would grow weary of casualties and negotiate peace rather than continue fighting. Genda knew this was fantasy. He had studied American history. Americans had fought a civil war that killed over 600,000 of their own people, and they hadn't quit. They had sent millions of men to fight in World War I in Europe, and they hadn't quit. The idea that Americans would lack fighting spirit was wishful thinking, based on racist assumptions rather than historical evidence. Moreover, Genda understood something his colleagues didn't grasp. The Pearl Harbor attack itself guaranteed American determination. The surprise attack, launched while Japanese diplomats were still negotiating in Washington, had enraged the American public in a way nothing else could have. President Roosevelt's speech calling December 7th a date which will live in infamy captured the national mood perfectly. Americans weren't debating whether to fight Japan. They were debating how harshly to punish Japan for the attack. The strike had unified American public opinion in a way no political leader could have achieved through speeches alone. Every calculation, every analysis, every piece of data pointed to the same conclusion. Pearl Harbor was a tactical success and a strategic disaster. Japan had gained 6 months to a year of operational freedom in the Pacific. In exchange, it had awakened American industrial might and guaranteed that America would fight until Japan was completely defeated. The trade was catastrophically unequal. In the months following Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces swept across the Pacific and Southeast Asia with stunning speed. The Philippines fell. Malaya fell. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable British fortress, surrendered after a brief siege. The Dutch East Indies were conquered. Burma was occupied. The Japanese Empire expanded at a pace that astonished even Japanese planners. Each victory reinforced the belief that Japan was invincible, that fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages, that Genda's warnings were just the pessimism of an overthinker. Victory fever gripped the Japanese military and the Japanese people, but Genda watched the calendar, knew that American aircraft carriers, untouched at Pearl Harbor, were operating somewhere in the Pacific. In April 1942, American bombers launched from the carrier USS Hornet attacked Tokyo itself. The Doolittle raid caused minimal physical damage, but it proved 2 critical things. 1. Japan was vulnerable. The home islands could be struck. 2. American carriers could attack anywhere at any time. In May 1942, at the Battle of the Coral Sea, Japanese and American carriers fought to an inconclusive draw. Japan achieved a tactical victory, sinking the fleet carrier USS Lexington while losing only a light carrier. But the strategic result favored America. The Japanese advance toward Port Moresby was halted. For the first time since the war began, a Japanese offensive had been stopped. The clock was ticking. Then came midway June 1942, exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto's prediction about running wild for 6 months was about to come true in the worst possible way. The Battle of Midway was supposed to be a trap for the remaining American carriers. Yamamoto planned to lure them into battle and destroy them, finally securing Japanese naval supremacy in the Pacific. But American codebreakers had cracked Japanese naval codes. They knew the attack was coming. They knew the target. They knew the timing. On June 4, 1942, Japanese carriers approached Midway Island with 4 fleet carriers. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, American dive bombers, launched from the carriers USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown, caught Japanese strike aircraft on their carrier decks while they were rearming and refueling for a second strike. In 5 minutes, 3 Japanese fleet carriers were fatally damaged. A fourth, Hiryu, was sunk later in the same day. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, nearly half of its carrier strength, in a single battle. Hundreds of irreplaceable, highly trained pilots were killed. America lost 1 carrier, USS Yorktown. The strategic balance in the Pacific shifted at Midway. Japan still had more carriers than America at that moment, but the margin was narrowing rapidly, and American shipyards were launching new carriers at an accelerating pace. Yamamoto's 6-month window had closed. In August 1942, American forces landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. It marked the beginning of the American offensive, the beginning of the end for Japan. The battle for Guadalcanal lasted 6 months. Japan poured resources into defending the island. Dozens of ships were lost. Hundreds of aircraft were shot down. Thousands of soldiers died of combat, disease, and starvation. In February 1943, Japan evacuated Guadalcanal. American forces were now firmly established in the Solomon Islands. The defensive perimeter was breached. From that point forward, the pattern Genda had predicted on December 8, 1941, played out exactly as his calculations had suggested. American forces, growing stronger with each passing month, advanced across the Pacific using a strategy called island hopping. They bypassed heavily defended Japanese bases, isolating them, cutting them off from supply. Japanese garrisons on bypassed islands were left to starve and wither, while American forces moved on to the next objective. Each captured island became a base for attacking the next island. Each advance brought American bombers closer to Japan itself. Meanwhile, Japanese industry struggled desperately to replace losses. By late 1943, Japan was losing ships faster than it could build them. Pilot training programs were cut short to rush replacement pilots to combat units. These poorly trained aviators died in their first battles against increasingly skilled American pilots. Aircraft production increased, but it couldn't match American output. In 1943, the United States produced over 85,000 military aircraft. Japan produced $16,000. The numerical gap had become an abyss. By 1944, everything Genda had calculated on December 8, 1941, had come true. American industrial superiority had translated into overwhelming military superiority. In June 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea saw Japanese naval aviation destroyed as an effective fighting force. American pilots, better trained and flying technologically superior aircraft, shot down over 600 Japanese aircraft in just 2 days. American sailors called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan lost 3 aircraft carriers and the majority of its remaining experienced pilots. The fleet that survived could no longer conduct offensive operations of any kind. In October 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in human history, saw the remnants of Japanese naval power committed to a desperate attempt to stop the American invasion of the Philippines. The results were catastrophic. Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, 11 destroyers. American losses: 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 3 destroyers. The Imperial Japanese Navy effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force after Leyte Gulf. By early 1945, American bombers were conducting sustained strategic bombing campaigns against Japanese cities. American submarines had strangled Japanese merchant shipping, cutting the home islands off from resources in occupied territories. Japan's oil imports had dropped to nearly zero. The Navy couldn't fuel its remaining ships. The Army was running out of ammunition. The industrial base was collapsing under sustained bombing. In April 1945, American forces invaded Okinawa, less than 400 miles from the Japanese home islands. The battle lasted 3 months and cost Japan over 100,000 military casualties. But Okinawa fell, giving America a base from which to launch the invasion of Japan itself. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, combined with Soviet entry into the war, finally forced Japan to accept the inevitable, unconditional surrender. The war ended in September 1945, 3 years and 9 months after Pearl Harbor.Genda had predicted that Japan would have 18 to 24 months before American superiority became overwhelming, was essentially correct. By mid-1943, Japan was fighting a purely defensive war it could not win. The remaining 2 years were simply the time required for American forces to physically reach and occupy Japan. After the war, Minoru Genda was interrogated by American intelligence officers. They were impressed by his candor and his analytical abilities. When asked when he knew Japan had lost the war, Genda replied without hesitation, December 8, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor. The Americans asked him why he didn't speak out more forcefully against the war if he knew it was unwinnable. Genda's answer was simple and honest. By the time I ran my calculations, the attack had already occurred. War had been declared. At that point, my duty was to fight as effectively as possible, to try to win despite the odds, to hope that my calculations were wrong. A pause. But I never believed they were wrong. The mathematics were too clear. Some Japanese officers after the war claimed they had always known victory was impossible, that they had fought only to secure better peace terms, to preserve national honor, to avoid unconditional surrender. Genda was more honest than that. He admitted that most Japanese officers genuinely believed they could win. They convinced themselves that American will would break, that fighting spirit would overcome material disadvantages, that somehow, someway, Japan would find a path to victory. Genda never shared those illusions. He knew from December 8, 1941, that Japan had lost the war. All that remained was to see how long defeat would take and how many people would die before the inevitable. And the story of Minoru Genda's calculations illustrates a fundamental truth about modern warfare. Industrial capacity matters more than courage, more than tactical skill, more than fighting spirit, more than any individual quality of soldiers or commanders. In a war of attrition between industrialized nations, the side with greater production capacity will eventually win, unless political factors intervene to end the war early. Japan gambled that political factors would intervene, that America, facing heavy casualties across thousands of miles of ocean, would negotiate rather than fight a long, grinding war. The gamble failed. Pearl Harbor ensured that America would fight until Japan surrendered unconditionally. And American industrial capacity ensured that such a fight would end in complete Japanese defeat. The mathematics were undeniable. From the very beginning, Minoru Genda survived where he later served in the post-war Japanese self-defense force, eventually rising to the rank of general. He remained active in military affairs until his death in 1984 at the age of 75. Throughout his post-war career, he was frequently asked about Pearl Harbor by historians, journalists, and military scholars. He always gave the same answer. The attack succeeded tactically but failed strategically. It was, in my view, the worst decision Japan could have made. He believed that Japan should have accepted American terms in 1941, withdrawn from China, preserved Japanese strength for a future opportunity, avoided a war Japan had no realistic chance of winning. Attacking Pearl Harbor guaranteed Japan's destruction. December 8, 1941. Day 1. Japanese officer calculated the numbers and realized that Pearl Harbor had just lost the war. He was right. The only tragedy was that it took 3 years, 9 months, and millions of deaths to prove it, and